This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Hey guys, time to get in on the action for the biggest moments in basketball with Prize Picks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. Just select 2 or more players, pick more or less on their projections, place your entry, and win up to 100 times your money. Right now, Prize Picks will match your first deposit of up to $100. Just download the Prize Picks app and use the code GET100. That's code GET100 on Prize Picks for a first deposit match of up to $100. Prize Picks. Pick more. Pick less. It's that easy.
Hi, it's William B. Davis. I play the smoking man on the X-Files, and you're listening to the X-Cast.
Welcome back, everyone, to the X-Cast. The truth is in here. I'm your host, Tony Black, for the Season 3 finale, in more ways than one, with our coverage of the Season 3 finale, Talitha Cumi, and this bringing us to the conclusion of our Season 3 coverage. And I had to be joined by the man who was here for the last finale, Anasazi, who's been here for the premiere, the Blessing Way, but we don't talk about that. It's Darren Mooney.
Hello, how are things?
Good. We were obviously having a chat last week with Wet Wired, so it seemed natural to bring you on for the big finale, the end, the end of the beginning, perhaps. So
I think that's 2 years down the line, but yes.
Well, the thing is as well, and here's a little bit of a insider production fact. We've got a bit of deja vu tonight because we've already done this, haven't we, Darren? That's the problem.
We have indeed. I mean, it's sort of like that. You know when they have a TV pilot and it's so bad that they go back and they like reshoot it without Colin Meaney. That's what it's like. Except this time, Colin Meaney refused to leave. I'm Colin Meaney in this case. That's exactly what this experience is like. No, there may have been a bit of a technical mishap. So, yes. But we're going to try and keep it fresh here. You know.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think Darren's bless him underplaying it slightly. There was a laptop. I'm calling it the laptopalypse. Like because my laptop literally died without edited. That's the best, the worst thing. Edited, really good Talitha Cumi recording. So
I like that, Tony. By the way, I like the way you're sort of overplaying. It was the best episode that we ever made. To be absolutely clear, it's the best thing that I have ever recorded, yep. And I don't think I'll ever record anything that quite lives up to it.
I was going to say we've never done anything that good, and we never will again. But hope you enjoy this one, guys, as we talk about, Talitha Cumi. So yeah, Talitha Cumi is the 24th episode of the 3rd season of The X-Files, and it first aired on May 17th, 1996. Has a story by David Duchovny and Chris Carter, and the teleplay itself was by Chris Carter, and it was directed by R.W. Goodwin. And the story sees a mysterious man named Jeremiah Smith appear after a shooting inside a fast food restaurant, who seems to be able to heal people with the palm of his hand, which draws Mulder and Scully into the mythic realms of esoteric conspiracy once more, and the machinations of the smoking man, which he's kind of putting it mildly, I suppose. But season 3 finale then, Darren, and obviously we're going to talk about. We're going to have some mailbag later on. We're going to wrap up Season 3 a little bit as well. And we're going to talk about what our ratings were for the season. But for Talitha Cumi anyway, part 1 of a 2-parter, what would you give it out of 10?
This is going to be one of those Darren crazy ranking things like sort of Hell Money or whatever. I'm going to go with like an 8.5, maybe even a 9 for this bad boy.
An 8.75 I thought you were going to go for there.
That also really works. Damn you and your maths.
Why would you give it between 8.5 and 9 then?
Because I absolutely really, really love this episode. I mean, I don't love it as much as I love Anasazi. I don't think it's the best cliffhanger or the best final episode of a season the show's ever done. In fact, the show does like end of season episodes very, very well. There's a solid argument to be made, and trust me, we're gonna make it with this two-parter, that the show is much, much better at ending seasons than it is at starting them. I think we sort of had that with Anasazi and with The Blessing Way, and you could argue that it happens with this as well. But one of the things I really like about Talitha Cumi is that even though it's not like the best season finale, and I'd argue that, for example, Anasazi's better, I'd argue that Requiem is better, I'd argue that, Essence and Existence are better, to pick other examples as well. Even the Erlenmeyer Flask, I think, is better as well. It's still a phenomenal episode of television because it's a very, very strange piece of television. And again, like we talked about this a little bit when we talked about The Blessing Way, where one of the great things about the X-Files was its ability to put something very, very strange on television in slots where you would not expect it. Like, if you were to say, like, what will the third season premiere look like after Anasazi? Nobody would have guessed The Blessing Way. And again, I say that as somebody who has maybe been a little bit harsh on The Blessing Way, but again, I talked about how much, like, as harsh as I am on it, I love that it swings for the fences, and it's absolutely its own thing. Talitha Cumi is exactly the same thing, in that it's an episode that maybe isn't as propulsive a finale as the Erlenmeyer Flask was, or to pick an example, as Anasazi was. Instead, it's this weird, very talky, very contemplative, very philosophical, very abstract piece of television in which, like, they lift pieces from, like, Dostoevsky, for example, as a reference source on this. It becomes this weird Freudian psychosexual drama wrapped inside like an alien colonization plot, wrapped inside an allegory about Jesus Christ and the New Testament in the world. And that's amazing. I absolutely love that this was a show that said, like, primetime television, season finale, show's about to become the biggest thing on television. What do we do? And the answer is this. And I kind of love it.
It's really unusual, isn't it? I mean, when you put it in those terms, you're absolutely right, and it sounds bonkers, and it's the kind of thing that you never really, when you sit and analyse it and you think about it, you wonder just how this ever came to be. How in like 1996, in what was the phenomenon of its day. By this point it was Gillian and David were on the cover of Rolling Stone. It was the biggest thing in the UK. It was probably the biggest thing in the US, or one of the biggest things in the US. It was winning Emmys and all these kind of things. It was the Game of Thrones, if you like, of its day. And then they do this really esoteric and unusual season finale, which is so different from a lot of the adventure, almost James Bondy kind of stuff we've seen mid-season, like Mulder leaping off the train. There's no. Well, I suppose there is kind of an actiony sort of element to the cliffhanger, but you know what I mean. It's like it's not that kind of episode, and you do love it for that. I mean, I would probably give it between an 8 and a 9 myself, because I've always been really fond of Talitha Cumi, and I think it gets a bit of a bad rep. Really, I think it doesn't quite get the love it deserves, and I agree. I don't think it's as good as particularly the Erlenmeyer Flask, which is probably my favourite season finale. It's not as good as Anasazi. It's not as good. I agree. It's not as good as Requiem, and certainly not as good as Biogenesis, which I love. But it without this, you wouldn't have had Biogenesis. You wouldn't have had the sixth extinction, and we'll talk about this a bit later. But it sets in motion a lot of things that are really quite crucial to the myth arc and the mythology and the future of the X-Files. So it's I just wish it got a bit more love. But I understand why it doesn't, because it doesn't fit a certain box, I suppose.
And I mean, like, we're probably going to talk about it later on. This is a great thing because we've already recorded a version of this podcast, so I know we're going to talk about this later on. But
we've lived this before, Darren. Yeah. We've lived it all before.
All of this has happened before and will happen again, Tony. But I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about, like, if you look at it in a certain way, this is not a good episode of television, in that it doesn't do a lot of the things that you would expect a basic episode of television to do. It has a lot of logical gaps. In fact, like, its actual plotting, if we want to talk about plotting as opposed to, say, its handling of theme, dialogue, like content, or like its engagement with like big ideas. If we want to talk just on a basis of getting your plot from A to B to C to D, it doesn't necessarily work as well as most of the other mythology episodes. So I entirely understand and respect why there are people out there who think this is like, I don't know if they think this is a shark jumping moment, because we're getting into the season that like contains home. But I understand if there are people who are like, this is a point where I started to get a little bit questionable, started to question the mythology. And I completely understand that and respect that, even though I wouldn't agree with this episode. I think you'd make a much stronger case with the next one, but we'll probably... I don't have to worry about that for another couple of months.
Yeah, we'll get there, and I think that's very true. But yeah, before we get to Herrenvolk and before we get even further into this episode, we need to have a look at the IMDb rating, which is obviously something that we always enjoy every time we're on, Darren, in terms of comparing where this is. It
always makes me feel good. It really makes me feel warm inside. It validates me.
It
shows me how in touch I am with the fan base and with people who appreciate this show.
Well, why don't you have a guess? Why don't you have a guess? Where do you think Talitha Cumi's gonna sit on the rankings?
Now, Tony, this is just cruel because you know that we've already recorded this, and you also know that I can't remember it, and you also know that I'm going to guess far too high based on past experience. But I'll go with, say, an 8.2.
Well, you're not a million miles away. This was an 8.7. So this puts it...
okay, wow.
Yeah, this puts it in line with Pusher. This puts it just under things like Apocrypha, Jose Chung's From Outer Space, Clive Bruckman's Final Repose, Paperclip. But it puts it in the higher tier, really, of the episodes in the season, higher than I would have given it credit for. But it's always the case. Like whenever you get an episode, like when we did Pusher, we were like, "How is that not a 9? How is that possibly not a 9?" But then in this case, you would have had a lot. I would have thought surely Talitha Cumi's going to be like a 7.9, given how many people don't particularly love it. But no, it's punching. I wouldn't say above its weight. I'm saying it's punching where it should be. So that's that's pretty good. Well done, IMDb. That one is out of 2,419 votes. So I think that's pretty. Yeah, that's pretty accurate. So
Tony, though, I think you're dodging the real question, though, which is how does this rank compare to The Blessing Way?
Oh, well, The Blessing Way. And, you may remember this from when we did it, but The Blessing Way is ridiculously highly ranked. The Blessing Way has 8.8. So it just shades both Talitha Cumi and Pusher, which I don't understand the world we live in, quite honestly. That's baffling to me. But, that's democracy. That's the people. That's the public, What can we say?
We need a second vote, Tony. We need a second vote.
We need an X-Files people's vote. Let's do it. So, with that, let's dig a bit deeper into the fingernails and start talking about Talitha Cumi in more detail. So obviously it begins with... I always feel like Talitha Cumi begins... in a way, almost like... It doesn't begin like a big mythology episode. It begins in quite, small surroundings. You've got this fast food restaurant... And, in Virginia, and you've got this guy, Galen Muntz, played by the wonderfully named Hrothgar Matthews, really good actor. And, he's just a loon. And obviously the whole point of it is it's the introduction to the character of Jeremiah Smith, when he heals with the palm of his hand. But it's still almost, if not a Monster of the Week beginning, it doesn't almost feel like a big, explosive, mythology season ending. Not like, something like Anasazi with a big earthquake in the middle of the desert and then an alien. This doesn't do that. It's very different. And I suppose in that respect, it sort of sets the tone for what's to come, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, I have a huge soft spot for the sort of opening scene of this episode, in large part because it is so small and it's so weird, much like the rest of the episode around it. Like, if you were to describe the plot of Anasazi, the plot of Talitha Cumi in terms of what actually happens in it, it's a lot less, it makes a lot less sense than something like the Erlenmeyer Flask, or, for example, Anasazi, where there's a go attribute to it. This is it's much weirder, it's much more lyrical, it's much more poetic. And you get that even in the opening scene, which is like a shooter in a fast food restaurant who takes hostages and who starts shooting when the police show up. But this mysterious stranger shows up out of nowhere, tries to talk him down first, and then after the shooting happens, he uses his power to heal this gunman, this man who has shot innocent people in a fast food restaurant. And there's this interesting thing that runs through it, and immediately sets up this idea, this sort of religious aspect of the episode, where Jeremiah Smith, as the man we discover, is named the guy who helps Muntz, who tries to talk Muntz down and then tries to heal him, and also very neatly, make sure that his shirt ends up nice and white at the end of it as well. But Jeremiah Smith tries to reason with him and tries to forgive him and approaches him with compassion, which is a very Christian attribute. Because, I mean, this is a very Christian episode. This is a very... And again, you mentioned that, like, Biogenesis is an episode that owes a lot to this. This is the point at which the show really begins, like, folding religion into the myth arc in a very big way. Now, they've done this before. You can point to earlier episodes. You know, you could point to, for example, Gender Bender in a certain light. But you can also point to stuff like, say, Fearful Symmetry, as an example. Even the title of Fallen Angel, if you want to look at another example of episodes that are about, like, this idea of this connection between the divine and the alien. And, like, Talitha Cumi very much sort of literalizes that idea, with Smith presented as a Jesus character. He heals people with the palm of his hand. But more than that, he goes out into the world and he preaches forgiveness. And that's something that I think people underrate about, like, Carter's writing, because a lot can be written about how Carter approaches religion, and a lot of how the X-Files approaches religion maybe hasn't aged perfectly well in some cases. I'm thinking like Signs and Wonders in the 7th season, where I think Frank Spotnitz summarized the moral of the story as intolerance is good. But I'm thinking more like this is the sort of thing that has aged remarkably well, where you have this idea of temperance and forgiveness. And it plays through a lot of Carter's later writing as well when it comes to religious stuff. I'm thinking of, for example, I Want to Believe, where there's this big arc about whether or not the characters can forgive a pedophile priest. And that's something that makes me feel very uncomfortable, and still makes me uncomfortable with the film. I'm not entirely sure where I fall on it, but I think it's a very bold choice from Carter. I think it's sort of something that's very striking and very Christian in a way. This idea that somebody who's done something horrible can be forgiven. And Carter comes back to it again in Babylon in the Revival series, another controversial episode, where he argues that a young boy who, you know, was a participant in a suicide bombing also deserves forgiveness and absolution for his sins, and that we need to forgive each other if we're going to move forward. And there's something very touching about Jeremiah Smith's conversation with Muntz, where he's trying to heal him not just literally but spiritually. And it's kind of, it's one of the nicer approaches to religion and Christianity on the X-Files as a whole. It's one of the more humanist and almost sort of Gnostic kind of qualities that the show sort of brings to that, I think.
Yeah, there's a very sort of holy aspect to the way Roy Thinnis portrays Jeremiah Smith as well. You know, he portrays him in very pastoral terms. He's very softly spoken. You know, he's polite. He's innocuous. You know, he has that, you know, almost, I hesitate to use the word monotone, because he's not monotone, but he's very calm, you know, and he has that sort of almost peace about him, which, you know, plays very much into the idea, doesn't it, you know, about him essentially, on the face of it, being almost like a God figure. But as you say, he's a Christ figure, he's a prophet, you know, he's the guy who comes down to impart, ultimately to try and impart this knowledge, you know, and gets caught up in all the esoteric stuff that we'll talk about. But I think a lot of that is owed to the performance you get from Roy Thinnis, who, of course, was an interesting casting anyway, because he has a place in the, you know, the origins of the X-Files in some respects, because he was the lead in a TV series called The Invaders many years ago, where he's in the 1960s, which Chris Carter had seen when he was a child, you know, when he was growing up, and he'd watched that show, which was all about a guy. It was basically like, you know, The Fugitive, if The Fugitive was, you know, trying to find aliens, essentially. And Roy Thinnis was playing a character called David Vincent in that, and trying to stop an alien invasion, which is quite appropriate. So there was a nice little bit of metatextual casting there with Roy Thinnis. And what was even nicer was that he got the part after he was sitting on a plane with David Duchovny. And David Duchovny presumably recognised him from The Invaders as well, and said, yeah, do you want to come on the show? Do you want to come on the X-Files? So there's a nice little aspect to there. But I think, yeah, he's a major reason why I think the character of Jeremiah is, certainly in this episode in particular, is an interesting one. And I think he has that balance, like you say, of the, you know, getting across that very healing Christian aspect with the mystery of precisely who he is and how people are essentially trying to exploit him, really.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. Like, I mean, there's also something interesting in the sense that, like, the aliens in the X-Files, and particularly like the colonists, tend to be portrayed as these sort of like Old Testament gods, in that they're very vengeful, they're very wrathful. Constantly throughout the run of the show, they're talking about like cleansing the earth, purging the earth, wiping people out, which is something very much sort of like an Old Testament god would do. In Fearful Symmetry, they're trying to gather up animals like as an interstellar Noah's Ark. And, you know, obviously later on you have like the plot to like release the virus, the smallpox virus, and wipe out the earth's population, which again is like a biblical plague. And so it's interesting in that context that you have the character of Jeremiah Smith, you know, who's like one, you know, he might as well be called Jesus Smith. It's got that nice sort of biblical quality to it. It's like John meet Jesus Smith. But he's got that sort of like, he's this more forgiving, more optimistic, more humanist kind of alien. He's this man who literally came down from heaven and saw something worth saving in mankind and so decided to do it. Because he's literally, like, the entire episode happens because presumably he was in that fast food restaurant for lunch and he happened to get caught up in this and he just couldn't stand by and let it happen. He couldn't stand by and be passive. He couldn't let these people die or suffer meaninglessly. He had to step in and he had to do the right thing, which is a very humanist sort of philosophy and something that's almost oddly heartwarming for a show that's occasionally about, like, you know, how the universe can seem like a cruel and arbitrary place, and no matter what you try and do, there'll always be men in suits who will try and stop you or destroy your life's work. There's something very touching in that.
There is, actually. And, you know, you've made me think of something it never really occurred to me before, that maybe Jeremiah was just there. You know, I've always assumed that he came down and he was intentionally trying to get to Mulder and taking him on this quest that we see in Herrenvolk and things like this. But, you know, the way you phrased it there and the way you've put it across is that he was working at the Social Security Administration, you know, and that very place itself is supposed to be a social insurance program, you know, to help people with disabilities, you know, retirement, benefits, things like that. In theory, an agency all about helping the less fortunate, which fits with the Christian ideal, really. So it's interesting that he's working there, and obviously that ties a little bit more into what Scully ends up looking into. But yeah, maybe he's just there, and then it's once he heals Galen, he sort of puts his head above the parapet and triggers all this, and then you've got the alien bounty hunter coming looking for him and all this. But maybe he just wasn't. He'd left, he'd gone off the reservation, he disappeared. And, you know, obviously later on in the X-Files, we sort of get suggestions that the colonists are this, you know, hegemonic force taking over the whole universe. So in theory, he could have gone anywhere. He could have gone to Earth, Vulcan, who knows, right? You know, he doesn't necessarily be on Earth. So it could have just been that he's one fairly insignificant guy, and we'll get to that later as well. And he's just gone from this massive, you know, network, you know, in the heavens. But this is what triggers everything that happens. I had never thought of it like that. That's really interesting. And it probably makes a lot of sense, actually.
Well, you were talking a little bit about how, like, the opening doesn't feel like a mythology opening, and you're entirely right. And I think that's quite intentional, because it does feel like something, like the workplace shooting, the guy who's been laid off and who feels angry and who draws a gun in a public space is a very 90s fear, but it's not like a 90s conspiratorial fear. It's something more like, say, Folie à Deux in season 5. You know, it's that sort of anxiety. It's an anxiety about just random violence, as opposed to the violence committed by conspiracies or by governments or by organizations plotting against you. So I think my reading of the episode has always been that was a completely random act, and it just seems like everything that flows sort of followed from that. It's like Jeremiah Smith got involved because he could not get involved, because he was a good man, which again is a very Christian attribute and something very humanist and warm.
I really like that. I looked at it in that way before. I think there's a lot of truth to that. Of course, on the flip side, if you've got the Christ figure, you've also got the devil hanging about, which is obviously increasingly becoming the smoking man. And this episode, I think, gets back a little bit more to the smoking man as much more of that independent villainous force that we saw in season 2, we saw in season 1, that has kind of, you know, and you've talked a lot about it on the X-Cast and over the 3rd season about how once the syndicate comes in, he's effectively middle management. You know, he's then sort of relegated to being part of this, you know, this cadre of, you know, old powerful men. But in this, you don't see the syndicate. There's no well-manicured man. There's no first elder. You know, all these kind of, that's a terrible impression. But I was going for the Marlon Brando. I can't do it. Maybe I'll do it in Herrenvolk and learn. But like, yeah, you know, you haven't got all these guys there. So he's sort of on his own, and he's at his most manipulative, especially in the sequence with Tina Mulder, where, you know, the classic sequence where he goes to the Quanagatog and the house looking for the weapon, as we later find out, and you get one of the, I think, well, it was William B. Davis's favourite line, but you get one of the most favourite lines from anyone, don't you? When he's talking about the water skiing.
But of course, that could be said for so many things.
Yeah, couldn't it? And obviously the suggestion heavily here is something that we've not quite got before, which was that the Smoking Man and Tina Mulder, you know, were getting it on years ago. and it was presumably an extramarital affair, which obviously the show does a lot more with later. But well, I mean, this does feel. I don't know what you think, Darren, but this does feel like an episode where the Smoking Man really sort of reasserts himself in a way as well, we'll get into this later, but the Grand Inquisitor of the X-Files.
Well, this is kind of interesting because I think that you're entirely right that it does sort of minimize the conspirators in that, like, he is the only conspirator who appears on screen. He deals with Jeremiah, and by implication, even though he doesn't deal with him directly, he deals with the bounty hunter as well when the bounty hunter comes to the empty cell. But like I think though it plays more into like that third season idea of the Smoking Man, the one that we've seen since The Blessing Way and Paperclip, which is this idea of a man who isn't necessarily like this abstract conception of evil, as we've always as we saw him in the first two seasons, who isn't like absolutely everywhere and all powerful. This is instead like a man who is like corrupt, who is weak, who is flawed in very fundamental ways. And like the fact that, he was having an affair implicitly with the wife of his best friend is a very human failing for the character to have. Similarly, the idea later on that he has lung cancer, which reinforces like the idea that he is, in theory, just a man. He's not like immortal. He doesn't have access to this technology that will magically heal him. He has to rely on Jeremiah Smith to do that implicitly in order to help him out. And I mean, even within that, there's this interesting sense when he's conversing with Jeremiah. I don't want to get too far ahead, but where Jeremiah is talking about how the cigarette smoking man is doing all of this. He's complicit in all these horrific actions, not to like secure his place on the throne, not to get himself named head honcho or to take over the world and establish like a dynasty of cigarette smoking men that will last from here to eternity. The cigarette smoking man is just doing this in order to be a commandant at the camps, to use that World War II sort of Holocaust metaphor, to secure his stake in the project. Rather than being like ahead of the line, he's simply above the chattel. That's what he's fighting to maintain. And there's something very sort of pathetic in that. There's something like, despite the fact that he's the only evidence of the conspiracy in the episode, in Talitha Cumi, I always sort of saw him as this kind of, I still see him as this sort of pathetic figure in a way that like, earlier in the season, The Blessing Way and Paperclip sort of reinforced. This guy who's dealing with things that are so far like outside of his control, but scrambling and doing whatever it takes to like just remain a few inches above water. Which is kind of depressing and bleak and really, really sort of a very banal sort of evil as opposed to this sort of overarching, like, puppet master.
I suppose it does make him more interesting, though, doesn't it? And rounded as a character. And I think it allows for things like that, that line we talked about with, the Smoking Man. It allows those kind of things to come out, and that almost that pettiness and that vindictiveness and, that those very human attributes as opposed to making him this, arch figure. And he would have been a lot less interesting had he been that, had William B. Davies not been able to get that inflection into it, and it was that was even that was a double joke in the sense that when he makes that joke, that double-edged meaning about water skiing, William B. Davies was a champion water skier. So there's two meanings to that whole thing. But I think it's a great scene because it really sets up several things. It sets that up, and it also makes you really start to question Tina Mulder. And so far you haven't seen a lot of her really. She obviously was in Colony and Endgame, and she's she's there, but there's always this massive level of dysfunction with the Mulder family as soon as you meet them, and obviously they had Samantha taken away, so she would have been affected by that all these years, losing her daughter, and then obviously her husband dies, and even though they're separated, and then you get Paperclip, which is where you get the first suggestion that Tina Mulder has always known more than she lets on. When she says, he goes to her and he says, did they make you make a choice? And she knew, essentially. She knew ultimately it was supposed to be Mulder who goes, but it was Samantha who's taken by the conspiracy. So I like the fact it sort of adds, without making Tina Mulder a bad guy in any way, you don't ever get that sense that she's complicit in all of this, but you definitely get a feeling that she's always known a bit more than she's ever told her son. And I really like that about this scene. And I love the fact that it cuts to, who we later realise is probably Mr. X, taking the pictures. And you don't hear their furious row that happens afterwards. Because it's almost like if you were listening to that conversation, you'd almost learn too much as an audience. So I like some of the choices made in that scene.
It is, and there's something really interesting about this, and it sort of ties back into what we're talking about with the cigarette-smoking man and his very human form of evil. But it's something that happens with the Mulder family in particular, outside of Bill Mulder, who was like an active participant in the project. It happens with Mulder later on when you get to like Two Fathers and One Son, but it implicitly happens with Tina Mulder in these episodes. And it's very telling that when the cigarette-smoking man arrives and asks her flat out this question, her first response is, "I've repressed it all." In that she's kind of, it's like, she makes it sound like a conscious choice. It's like she sat down one day, closed her eyes, clenched her fists, and buried what she knew so deep inside herself that she'd never have to acknowledge it or face it or confront it. And it's an interesting idea, because you said that she's not really complicit, and you're right that she's not literally complicit, in that there's an implication that she never made an active choice. She never sat down and said, "I am okay with this," to Bill. But the show also sort of suggests that on some level, whether consciously or unconsciously, she knew, and if it was unconsciously, she made a choice not to know or not to confront it. And does that in its own way sort of represent a complicity? Does that represent like buying in? You know, was she part of the project? She may not have been as directly involved as Bill, but did she offer passive consent to it? Was she, like, because she was going to be a beneficiary of this as well, she was presumably going to survive hybridization along with Bill Mulder. And was she willing to make those sacrifices as long as she didn't have to acknowledge that she made those sacrifices? And it's an interesting exploration of how these sort of systems of like oppression and complicity operate, where they don't always have to be spoken and it doesn't always have to be active. And there's something there with Tina where you're never entirely sure how much she knew, how much she didn't know, how much of a choice she made, and how much of a choice she made not to make, if that makes sense, which makes her a very interesting character, I think, in the overall scheme of the show.
Yeah, and it's something they don't really get into. You know, there's never a conversation you ever get where Mulder sits down with Tina and says, "Right, come on, Mom, let's have it out. Let's tell me everything. Tell me everything you know." You know, you never get that. You never, for whatever reason, whether Mulder, you know, my instinct was Mulder was always a bit too scared. Mulder was always a bit too scared to possibly confront the reality that maybe his mom could have given him a bit more of this truth than he ever imagined, and that he would see her differently, because ultimately she was essentially the only person that he has left. You know, with Samantha gone, once his dad's gone, you know, he hasn't got any other siblings. She's kind of the only person, and that's why this becomes a really personalised case for Mulder once she's in the hospital, you know, and she's had this stroke and she's at death's door. And a lot of the urgency about the story in Talitha Cumi is about him trying to figure out a way to save his mother, you know, and it's because for years she is, and it's very telling that, you know, Tina's eventual death comes at the point where Mulder gets his release from Samantha, you know, and it's quite, well, we're a long way away from that, obviously, in season 7, but, you know, so I think there's a lot to unpick there, really, with their relationship.
Oh, there is indeed. And I mean, there's a lot to unpick about, like, Mulder's passive complicity in all this as well. Because I think one of the interesting things the show does, and it doesn't always get a lot of credit for, is it explores, like, that level of, like, complicity as it goes. So, like, you know, Tina was not an active participant, but she was married to Bill and she was willing to turn a blind eye to what he did. But then, like, later on with Mulder, you have, like, his inability to confront, like, what happened with his mother. And like, in that episode you talk about, it's very telling that Mulder can't accept that his mother could die of natural causes, to pick an example. But I mean, even in, like, Two Fathers and One Son, which is way down the line, you have Mulder making a series of choices which are really, really uncomfortable. But I think they're meant to be, because they suggest that, like, Mulder is in his own way like a beneficiary of this sort of complicity and this privilege that he's had. And it's kind of, it is challenging and it is interesting and it's sort of provocative. And I think the show avoids giving easy answers, which I really admire about it.
Yeah, it is really good in that sense. And the further you get into the Mulder family's sort of central part in this labyrinth conspiracy, the more interesting it gets, I guess. But obviously, you know, the episode becomes as much about, you know, as Mulder's mom is in the hospital, it becomes about the search for the weapon and the fiendish anagram that is at the heart of this this episode. What could it mean? Why would Tina write palm on what a coincidence, Darren? I mean,
what a staggering coincidence. I mean, like, this is the thing where, like, Again, I absolutely love that this episode is as weird as it is, and I absolutely adore that it devotes, and I'm sure we're going to talk about them in a moment, the scenes with like Jeremiah Smith and the smoking man, and I absolutely love that it's vaguely religious, and it's like a gospel, and it's very, sort of involved in this idea of Christianity and complicity and stuff like that. But on a basic plotting level, there are whole swaths of the episode that make absolutely no sense and exist purely so that they can operate on symbolic logic. So, for example, the fact that, like, Tina's stroke causes her to mangle the word lamp, so it looks like palm, which, by coincidence, Jeremiah Smith uses his palm to heal people, and by coincidence, apparently, let's stop and unpack this, by the way, right? So there's a stiletto, which is apparently the only thing that can kill alien bounty hunters, except it's not, because later on somebody just shoots one in the back of a neck, and also it doesn't, because later on Mulder uses it, and it doesn't quite work. But anyway, let's just gloss past that. So it's a pointy thing, and you stick it in the back of the neck of an alien. Now, nobody explains why you can't just mass-produce these things. I don't know why. Are they made of a special mineral? It's never really explained. Nobody's explained why you couldn't just use a really sharp kitchen knife if you jabbed it hard enough, but that doesn't matter. And so on. And nobody explains, like, why Bill Mulder is apparently the only person in the conspiracy who was issued one of these, apparently. And why, if he was the only person in the conspiracy who was issued with these, he chose to hide it in a lamp. And why, if he was the only person in the conspiracy who was issued one of these and decided to hide it in a lamp, he hid it in a lamp in a house in the middle of nowhere where he didn't live and his family didn't live and he hadn't lived there since the divorce. It's like, oh my god, the aliens are invading. Oh, well, don't worry, I have a weapon that will help us. It's in that home that we don't go to since the divorce that destroyed my family. And it's buried in a lamp, one of them. It's a very strange setup, and it makes no sense, and it doesn't work apart from to get to, like, you get a sense that, like, Carter and maybe Duchovny were involved in this and going, well, we need something that's an anagram of, like, palm, so that she can say palm and Mulder can think she means Jeremiah Smith, but when she actually means something else. So what around a house, is an anagram of palm, and it's like, Maybe Bill Mulder could have a palm tree. It could be in the bottom of a potted plant. And they're like, no. I got it. It makes no sense on any sort of literal narrative level. But you kind of just go with it because the symbol... Well, I go with it. I say you go with it. I go with it because the symbolism is strong enough for me that it kind of works in a lyrical, sort of poetic way. And it gets us a sight of Mulder throwing lamps at a wall, which sort of symbolizes this idea of him destroying the memory of his family, like the cigarette-smoking man has done. Mulder's literally tearing up the happy memory of his childhood. He's smashing it to pieces and tearing it apart, looking for answers in a way that he can't do with, as you pointed out, in the relationship that he has with Tina. So it works very well, like, symbolically and thematically, but in terms of plot, it makes absolutely no sense.
Doesn't make a lick of sense. I kind of wish it had been under a palm tree, though. And especially maybe they could have done a wink to It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. I don't know if you've ever seen that film, but they have to bury the treasure under a big W, and they go to like they go to like the Mexican border, and they have this madcap chase to get to the big W, and it's under a massive like palm tree. So if only that had been the case, that would have been the best movie wink in the history of cinema and television.
I feel like it maybe would have sort of cut away from the tension of Mulder wondering whether his mother's going to survive her stroke. Be like, yeah, this was actually kind of fun. It really took my mind off the whole stroke thing. Nothing like a good adventure on the Mexican border to kind of get the blood pumping.
Yeah. It could have been a nice little diversion if they'd have had the budget. But it is silly, and I mean. The weapon is interesting, obviously, because it's something that X very much talks up when they have their fight and they have their confrontation. That he basically says, this is going to be, its value will soar once the sky begins to fall. And Mulder mentions colonization, and everything like that. So it's very much suggested that this weapon is really important. And my view of it was that, this episode very much tries to really set Mulder back onto the idea that he's on this almost monomythical journey, this mythic quest within and without, and it's giving him the weapon, like the lance that from ancient,
or Excalibur, for example.
Yeah, or Excalibur, that kind of thing. It's given him that mythic weapon in order to take down the demon, the beast, in this case, the alien bounty hunter. But it's
and
one
what
of those
a
things...
fantastic job that does in Herrenvolk. But we'll talk about that next time.
We'll get to that. Talk about other things that don't make a lick of sense. We'll get there. But That's the thing. It's kind of, I understand the point of the weapon, but in logical terms, it doesn't make any sense. And you're absolutely right in that why would it be hidden there? And surely all the conspirators would get one. You'd think at the top level they'd all have one in their back pocket. And there's no suggestion that they do. There's this, in many ways, it's suggested that this might be one of the few weapons that's out there. So they're like these mythical weapons that are lying in lamps or whatever. I love the idea that they're all in lamps, like everywhere.
Mulder didn't smash enough lamps around the house. We actually have one for everybody in the audience. Because I kind of love the idea, of D-Day arriving and the colonists coming down and Mr. X standing there with his little pincer that has it has about 2 inches range, and you have to be directly behind the person who's using it. And I just have this image of the alien bounty hunter arriving with a gun and Mr. X realizing that this was not the good strategy. This was not the best strategy right now.
Mr. X is, the scene in Raids of the Lost Ark where the swordsman does all the and then Indy just pulls the gun out. Mr. X is the swordsman in that scenario. It is silly. I mean, why? I mean, my headcanon assumption is that metal is magnetite, which is what destroys a lot of these aliens in the season 9 and everything like that. But who knows? I mean, the thing is, it would make a lot more sense if you put all that magic into a gun. Yeah, into a bow and arrow or whatever. Just
sort of throw it.
Yeah, a little bomb. Who knows?
Just before we sort of go off there, and it is worth, because you point out magnetite, and it is worth noting, and again, for all that we mock this plot point, and I think to be fair, it is a very mockable plot point, and I say this as somebody who gave the episode 8.5 or 9 out of 10. What I think works, though, and I think that it's telling that the mythology works much, much better in the 3rd season than it does in the 9th season, where you actually explain stuff like that, is that the show at this point is treating the mythology, and I don't know whether it's the influence of Carter or whether it's the influence of Duchovny. You pointed out this Campbellian hero, this sort of mythic journey, and Duchovny is a big fan of that idea of the mythic journey and that Campbellian quest and stuff like that. And I think that the show and the mythology in the 6th season, as much as people complain about the show being too abstract or being sort of too vague or being too ambiguous or not being precise enough, I suspect a large part of why the show succeeded as much as it did, and a large part of why it worked, and a large part of why people, myself included, are much fonder of, say, the mythology in the first 5 seasons than they are in the last couple of years, is because the mythology is written in a way that's intentionally vague and avoids a lot of technobabble. So, while the show never explains why that little sort of stiletto is so effective, or, never provides any sort of, vaguely pseudo-scientific sounding reason, I also think that a large part of why the show was so successful was its refusal to do that. So, even here you have, dialogue that refers to colonization without saying how it's going to happen, the greater purpose, the project, the date is set, all these, abstract ideas, rather than, actually literally explaining what the plot of the X-Files is. That makes it sound almost poetic and grandiose, and in a way that makes it almost respectable. And I have a pet theory that I think the reason why, you mentioned that this is the point where the show was winning Emmys, and it was. This year, for example, it won Best Guest Star for Peter Boyle in Clyde Bruckman's Final Repose, and Best Screenplay for Darren Morgan, Best Teleplay for Darren Morgan for that same episode. And it would be nominated repeatedly for Outstanding Drama Series, up until, I think, the 6th season. And it was accepted in a way that contemporary genre shows like Babylon 5 or Star Trek weren't. And I wonder if part of that was down to the fact that it didn't have that technobabble in it. It didn't use phrases like super soldiers or magnetite in those peak mythology years, and instead used abstract nouns like the project or the date or the greater purpose. And I wonder if that made the show sort of more acceptable to, say, newspapers like The New Yorker or magazines like The New Yorker that would have sort of praised it a great deal, that would have maybe been turned off if it had been more sort of technobabble driven, like, say, Star Trek or Babylon 5 or even Space Above and Beyond.
Yeah, I think probably. I mean, I suppose it does give it more of that mythic sensibility, doesn't it? It gives it more of that, yeah, as you say, that abstraction to it. And I mean, it's nowhere sort of better displayed in this episode than in the sequence where Jeremiah's captured and he's locked away in this prison. You get those wonderful few scenes between him and the smoking man, which are, among the most strange and almost indulgent sequences that the X-Files ever does. But they're so literal. They're so filled with that, and one of the key things with this episode that a lot of people know is that David Duchovny, in devising it, very specifically wanted to bring in allusions to the brothers Karamazov, which is the classic Dostoevsky novel you mentioned at the top of the episode. And it's very much filled. It's, you know, it doesn't necessarily take dialogue from that story, but it's filled with these allusions. It's filled with this, you know, this conversation and this dynamic between, you know, the character of Jeremiah and the Grand Inquisitor himself, the Smoking Man. And, you know, that's the thing. I mean, the title itself, you know, links to, you know, the Christian, even the Aramaic sensibilities that Duchovny's interested in. You know, Talitha Cumi is literally translated as a rise maiden, and it has various different translations, but it's all about that you know, that healing, that rebirth, that cleansing, that, you know, and this conversation is the height of that mythic literary sensibility in this episode. And I mean, I know you're a massive fan of it as well, Darren. I think the dialogue in those sequences, on the one hand, it might seem really sort of pretentious, but on the other hand, I think it's really, really lyrical and fascinating.
It does. I mean, like, imagine being a Fox executive, like, at the time in, 1996? And sort of, like, imagine sitting down and going, well, look, The X-Files is the hottest young show we have here. We've got David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson in their underwear on the cover of Hot Press magazine. These are sexy people who are loved by sexy young kids, and this is the sexiest young show on television. I'm just going to go to this screening that Carter's organized of the season finale, and I bet it's going to be hot, it's going to be sexy, it's going to be amazing, it's just going to be fantastic. And you sit down and you get these two extended sequences where middle-aged men trade dialogue about, like, abstract concepts like free will, governance, self-determination, complicity, the idea that, you know, if you give somebody, like, if you absolve a man's conscience, he will do whatever you need him to do, which are these, like, wonderfully abstract philosophical ideas, which are universal and relevant no matter where. In fact, those sequences have aged, like, arguably as well as anything in the X-Files, in that they're still relevant today, and you can still apply them to contemporary politics easily enough. But it's, like, I'm just imagining what it must have been like as a Fox executive, expecting something, like, sexy and cool and flash and dynamic, and, like, something that looks like a blockbuster action movie like Nicey or 731, and instead getting a duologue between two men in a prison cell together. And I mean, I think I mentioned this before, but, like, one of my favorite, like, pieces of trivia about Talitha Cumi comes from William B. Davis's memoir, Where There's Smoke, which is, it's a great memoir. It's really conversational. It's very wry. And Davis has this wonderful sense of humor that comes through writing about the show. And, you know, sometimes he's a little bit irreverent, but he's also very respectful of it. But he talks about how, and this amazes me, right? This is the level of impact that this sequence had on viewers, which is the moment where apparently himself and Thinnes were hired by this billionaire to fly out to this guy's wedding and perform on stage the two scenes from Talitha Cumi where they debate the nature of free will, like, as a wedding reception performance. Now, Tony, I know you got married, and I just want to ask you, was this ever an option?
Well, I mean, I'm just really sad that I didn't know about it, because I'm sure I could have sold my, you know, wife to be on it. Absolutely. She's only watched about one season and a little bit of the X-Files, but I'm sure I could have said, honey, look, there's a wonderful scene with allusions to, you know, the Judeo-Christian mythic journey and and free will and determinism. And you know, what better way could we celebrate the most, you know, special day of our life? She'd have gone for it, of course.
I think it would have been an easy sell. I'm just wondering, at that wedding, right? You imagine that there were probably, like, half the crowd there was like, I remember watching this live. But you have to wonder what the other half was making of this. It's like, is this a beat poem? Is this what the kids call performance art? I don't get it. Why are they talking about colonization?
Yeah. You just need Louis Theroux to be there, don't you, and film that wedding. But that's the thing. It has such a, you know, if it made that much of an impression on people, I think it's one of those sequences that people just remember, you know, especially X-Files fans, especially given the fact, you know, you get some lovely cameos in there. You know, you get Peter Donat back as Bill Mulder, you get Jerry Harding back as Deep Throat. You would have had Melinda McGraw as Melissa Scully, but sadly she wasn't available to do it. And I think that would have been fascinating because, you know, it's very much visiting the sins back on the smoking man. It's reflecting. He's been very disparaging to Jeremiah. Calling him Catalock. You mean nothing. You are nothing in the grand scheme. And that's something that runs through into Herrenvolk as well. This idea that ultimately you are meaningless as the individual unless you are given this truth to play with. And that's something that comes up in the next episode. But in this case, Jeremiah might seem to us and to everybody else this prophetic healing Jesus, but in the ultimate grand scheme of the large forces above in the heavens, he's nothing. He's just a one person who can make no difference. And that's fascinating, but that's why it's almost, you mentioned the lung cancer earlier. It's almost it's a real sting in the tail in that he is the one that heals the smoking, and in fact it shows his moral weakness in that he heals the smoking man in order to buy his freedom, and that's essentially shows how venal the smoking man is.
My personal favorite detail though is immediately after the smoking man has had this near death encounter with lung cancer, which by the way, even though I'm guessing he's not an oncologist, he's aware that having lung cancer once, even if it's healed by an alien, I imagine that's still remission. I imagine relapse rates are significantly high. I'm not sure what the statistics are when you're healed by a messianic alien, but I'm pretty sure it's like any other form of remission. And the first thing you see in the next scene with the cigarette smoking man, he's wandering around a hospital with a cigarette in his mouth. And the episode doesn't make it the episode doesn't pull its punches. It immediately follows the scene with him with the cigarette in his mouth, with Mulder trying to jam a gun in there, as if to say, look, the cigarette smoking man has been given a second chance at life, and he's basically decided to put a gun back in his mouth. It doesn't matter whether it's Mulder's gun or the cigarette. He's basically decided that his own life is, he hasn't decided, he's not going to look out for his own life. He's decided he's going to indulge these bad habits, even though he knows exactly where they're going to lead. It's a great character touch.
Yeah, it is, and it shows his lack of respect really or his cockiness and his overconfidence, and that's one of the things. The arrogance of the man really comes out in this episode in particular. When in that confrontation with Mulder, which is one of their sort of calls back to One Breath really, in that sense. In fact, I don't know if this is the first major confrontation they've had after One Breath. It might be, actually, apart from the odd phone call here and there or the odd brief exchange.
Or F. Emasculado, isn't he there in F. Emasculado?
Oh yeah, they have a little bit of a back and forth there, don't they? But yeah, maybe the next one with a gun at least. But yeah, he is just full of that overconfidence really. And obviously then, it's all ultimately then about Mulder realising that he needs to get to Jeremiah in order to heal his mother, in order to save Tina's life, in order to get this healing power. And that brings you to the cliffhanger. But before we get there, we've got to mention one person who we've barely talked about in this episode, and it's possibly one of the negative aspects about Talitha Cumi, in that Scully barely has anything to do in this episode, really, doesn't she? She's just sort of there with Mulder. There is those scenes where she's, maybe having conversations with Skinner, and she's having, to investigate Jeremiah at the Social Security Administration and things like that. And in fact, this does allow for a much better sort of Scully payoff in Herrenvolk, actually. But she gets a short shrift considering this is a season finale.
She does indeed, and I mean, you're half tempted to say that this might be a result of it being a Duchovny written episode, in that Duchovny is very much interested in what drives Mulder, and that makes a great deal of sense as a writer. Actors who write tend to, it's natural to be drawn, because I don't mean in a selfish put the spotlight on me way, although maybe that's an aspect of it, but if you're an actor, you're spending a lot of time in the headspace of the character that you're playing, and you're spending a lot of time, in many cases, developing a backstory, because as an actor, when you step into a role, you generally have to put a bit more thought into it than the television show writers, because they discover it as they go. They sort of flesh out the character as they go, but if you're playing a character on television, you like to have a sense of who that character character is from the get-go. So sometimes, like, actors have invented more of their characters than the writers at a certain point. And so you see that, I think, with Duchovny's episodes, the episodes that he's credited on. Like, I'm thinking, for example, of Colony and Endgame, or in the second season, where there's an emphasis on Mulder there. Here, there's an emphasis on Mulder's family. Also in Anasazi, there's an emphasis on Mulder's family. But even if you go to things later on, and you look at, like, the episodes that Duchovny wrote and directed, for example, later on, he finds stuff for Scully to do in both, say, The Unnatural and Hollywood AD. But they are, I think, to a certain extent, more Mulder-centric, or at least The Unnatural is, in that it's about Mulder's sudden obsession with baseball. He's the prism through which the story is told. He's the character who sort of provides the framework for the narrative. And I suspect that maybe Duchovny driving the narrative might explain why Scully doesn't get so much to do, because she's left doing sort of the homework almost. She's left connecting the pieces. She's the one, like, there's the great bit where Mulder, who's having this big, like, familial breakdown, comes into work, and Scully's like, oh, by the way, while you were gone, that guy we're looking for, he came into the office, you completely missed it, it's fine, I got it covered, I'm doing the actual work here, you just continue doing what you're doing.
Yeah,
but yeah,
exactly. I think you're absolutely right. I think you could draw a line, quite honestly, between from Colony all the way through to Talitha Cumi, all the way actually to the Sixth Extinction. And I think you would find, much as they're not exactly the same story, I think you would find a very significant connective tissue with the idea of Mulder's internal quest, his mythic journey. And that's something I think Duchovny's very interested in. And it's quite interesting how Carter doesn't really know what to do with that, I think, in quite the same way as Duchovny does, because I think this is where Duchovny's literary background, you know, as a PhD, near enough a PhD, almost a PhD major in English literature, comes in, because when you get to Herrenwald, Carter just can't stick the landing with this. He just can't, without necessarily quite the same level of input as Duchovny in terms of the storytelling. And I think, you know, again, in the Sixth Extinction, which I think is a massively underrated story, you get those, you know, Duchovny influences. You get a lot of that, you know, religious iconography, and it calls back a lot to this kind of thing. And I think that's one of the things that punches Talitha Cumi up for me. And yeah, Scully is a little bit of a casualty of it, I think. But in this case, I kind of think I can live with that, because, I mean, because ultimately we know that Scully very much gets great material going forward, but also the fact that I think you kind of couldn't serve two masters necessarily in the same way and still do what this episode did, and have the freedom to do those kind of scenes we've talked about with the Smoking Man and Jeremiah talking about all this, you know, these really sort of high-end literary sort of conversation. And I'd rather maybe sacrifice a little bit of Scully focus so we could have a bit of that once or twice.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that in the grand scheme of things it sort of balances out. And I mean, I think that the interesting thing about, and we're going to talk generally about the third season later on, but one of the things the third season does rather well with Scully's character is that it acknowledges that in the second season, I think Scully wasn't necessarily best served by, or Gillian Anderson maybe even wasn't best served by what happened to Scully as a character. But Scully as a character herself didn't always get the space to, like, breathe and develop. And in the third season, you have a bit more kind of space for that. You have, like, Nicey and 731 with the alien abductees. You have her sort of processing through what happened. You have the arc where, with her sister's killer in, like, Apocrypha and Piper Maru and stuff like that. So when you get to the end of the season, it doesn't feel like it felt at the end of the second season, where, like, Scully's big arc was she was abducted and taken away because Gillian Anderson got pregnant, and then she was abducted again in the other big two-parter so that Mulder, you know, had to surrender his sister and, you know, maybe feel really bad about it. So I think that, yeah, it's an issue with the episode, but it doesn't feel as bad because I think you know that either side of it, Scully gets a lot to do. And I mean, you're talking about, like, the fourth season, which has perhaps the meatiest Scully arc in the entire run of the show. It's the arc for which Gillian Anderson deservedly won an Emmy. I'm not as fond of the episodes in question as many fans, but Anderson's work is phenomenal, and the show devotes a lot of focus and attention to Scully. So I mean, I don't feel too bad about her maybe getting the short shrift here, although I would be cognizant of that fact. And I mean, it would be nice if you could find something for her to do in there that wasn't just, like, the actual work of being an FBI agent.
Yeah, no, I know. It's difficult, really, and, you know, how you would do it slightly differently, really. But she's there at the cliffhanger anyway, which is where Mulder's having one of the many conversations where he says, "Okay, Jeremiah, tell me what's happening. Tell me what's going on." And Jeremiah's like, "I'll explain everything to you. I'll tell you everything."
Spoiler, he may not.
He won't, right? But like, and then obviously, Terminator Brian Thompson turns up, and you've got that great. Now, the thing is, I've always been this cliffhanger gets a lot of flack as well, and with Mulder standing there with his magic weapon, his Excalibur, and Scully there, at the side, Jeremiah looking terrified, and Mulder having literally no idea what to do next as the bounty hunter is marching towards him. Now, it's not as powerful a cliffhanger as Anasazi. It's not as potentially interestingly open-ended as the Erlenmeyer flask, but I like this, probably partly for nostalgia reasons, because it was the first big cliffhanger I remember watching The X-Files religiously every week, because it was sort of the start of season 3. I started watching it religiously every week when it was airing, and I remember getting to the summer of '96, getting to this and going, "Oh my god, I'm going to wait like 3 or 4 months for this," and it killed me, and I got fond memories. But I think I like the way it's slightly different. You are going to have to pick up probably straight away, which is what Herrenbolt does from this. So I quite like the fact it brings it to that point where Mulder is standing there, he doesn't have a clue what to do next. And it's built up to, again, this sort of mythic confrontation with the hero and the beast. And in that respect, I think it maybe gets it's a little bit too underrated.
It is. Well, it's a very meat and potatoes sort of cliffhanger, and I've always admired this. Again, we're going to talk a little bit about the third season later on in a bit more depth. But one of the things I really like about the third season, and I think that I may have interviewed Zach Hanlon and Todd Vanderwolf, who wrote the book recently, Monster of the Week, and they argue that the thing about the second season of the X-Files is about experimentation and going big and trying new things, and the third season of the show is about figuring out what worked in the second season and just doing that really, really, really well. And so I think that it's kind of appropriate that, the second season finale is this big, apocalyptic, nothing is the same, Mulder's being burnt alive inside, a tomb with a bunch of dead aliens, and everything is to play for, and nothing could possibly survive that. And then in contrast, with the third season, you have something that's a bit less apocalyptic, that's something that's a bit more meat and potatoes cliffhanger. It's like, oh my god, how is Mulder going to get out of this one? And it's almost like, you could cut to it, and that could be an act break rather than a season-ending cliffhanger. It's very business as usual. It's like the show is saying to its audience, look, trust us. We figured out. We know what we're doing at this point. We'll be back next year. We're not blowing everything up. It's not going to be radically different, but you're probably going to enjoy it because, let's face it, it's been a pretty great year, hasn't it? And it's worth noting, actually, we haven't talked much about R.W. Goodwin, who directed this episode. This episode actually looks really, really great. And I mean, we talked a lot about the dialogue, because it is very dialogue-heavy. We talked about all the exposition, and we talked about the thematic stuff. One of the things I really like about this episode is its visual storytelling. There are extended sequences in here where the episode tells its story without using dialogue. And as much as we talk about Carter being a very exposition heavy sort of writer, there's a really, really good use of sort of visual storytelling. I'm thinking, for example, of Mulder tearing up his family home, which is a sequence that goes on for a good 2 or 3 minutes, but which captures everything that you need to know without any dialogue to explain it. I'm also thinking of the great sequence where the cigarette smoking man goes and they arrest Jeremiah Smith at the bureau, which is done again silently without any dialogue, but works very, very well and communicates everything you need to know. But even that cliffhanger, it has a really wonderful shot. And you mentioned this being sort of mythical. And the shot that I'm thinking of is the one where Scully arrives with Jeremiah and Mulder sort of walks out from behind the pile of wood chippings. But there's a little reflection of him in the water, carrying, as you pointed out, this really lame Excalibur. And in that moment, my mind immediately goes to the Excalibur myth. It's the lady in the lake or the sword in the lake. It's this idea of this reflection of Mulder suggesting this sort of it's kind of weird mythic image that works really, really well. And you're right that while it's a very meat and potatoes cliffhanger, it looks absolutely amazing. It looks beautiful, and particularly in high definition with, as you pointed out, the Terminator sort of gunning down on you. I think it works really, really well. I'm actually really, really happy with the cliffhanger at the end of the episode.
Me too. I really like it, and I think it brings it to a, like you say, a meat and potatoes fun conclusion, and gives you something to really be excited about for next season. So it's a shame we get Herrenvolk, but we'll get to that soon. Okay. But before then, we're going to dive into what you guys thought and talk about the listener mailbag for Talitha Cumi. So, yeah, we've got quite a few comments about this. We're going to go through, and I think what we'll do is we'll kind of blend some of these comments with what people thought of Season 3 as a whole, because I asked for everyone's, and we're going to do this in a little while, your top 3 and bottom 3 episodes of Season 3, given we're at the end of the season, and what you thought. So, some people have given me some of theirs. So let's start with Michael Little, who said, I think it's a decent finale of the season that gets bogged down in the colonisation pretentiousness. The cliffhanger is nothing, so he's not going to have agreed with what we've just said. Still, there are some great scenes. And his bottom 3 of the season is Teso dos Bichos, which I suspect is going to come up again and again. Avatar and Revelations, and his top 3 is Pusher, good man, Clive Brookman, and 731. Adam Silver says, doesn't have the stakes or cliffhanger of Anasazi, but a solid Season 3 finale overall. Maybe not reaching the level Season 3 deserved. Roy Thinnis is great as Jeremiah Smith. Memorable scenes include Smoking Man with Mulder's mom and Jeremiah Smith, Mulder finding the stiletto, and Mulder and X getting into a fight over it. And I suppose we haven't really talked about the fight, have we? Because obviously this is the last time that Mulder and X ever see each other, which is, I guess in many ways, pretty bittersweet, as an ending for them.
Yeah, Mulder gets to think for the rest of his life, I could have taken him. It is a weird scene. In many ways, like, that sequence feels like, again, we talked a lot about how Fox executives must have looked at this episode. One imagines that, like, the X scene with Mulder is one of the few actual action beats in the entire episodes. The few times in the episodes where something actually dynamically, like, happens, as opposed to, like, a really atmospheric shot of, like, characters, delving into their inner psyche, or talking in extended metaphors about, like, the brothers Kamenov. This is, like, the point at which you get, like, the action payoff, which makes it very strange, because it's like, again, you think of, like, the first season finale, which had, like, the alien, like, in the jar, and it also had, like, obviously Deep Throat getting shot. You think of the second season finale, which had, like, everything involving Mulder's paranoia breakdown, the murder of his father, the attempted murder of Krychek, the point at which Scully shoots him, all this high-stakes action. And you think of the third season finale, and the third season finale doesn't really have that much action going on at all. I mean, the only gunfight in it is the one at the start in the teaser, and that's presented more as a horror than as something that's sort of visceral and meant to get the audience's blood pumping. So I've always found the fight very strange. The fight always feels like something that was sort of mandated, but it also, to be fair, feels very true to the character of X and Mulder, and feels like a very honest way for them to leave their relationship, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And you can hear Stephen Williams, Mr. X himself, talking about this in the interview that Kurt North did with him, which is going to be out. It's out for patrons now, if you're a subscriber, but otherwise it's going to be out around the time of Herrenvolk. So he gets into a little bit of this and talks about it. Chris Humphreys says he absolutely loves the scene, starting from X keeping a, air quotes, discreet distance to the goons, inconspicuously, but not so inconspicuously, closing in on Jeremiah Smith into him being incarcerated. Made even more dramatic by Snow's score. Moments like this are those magic ones that make you feel something much bigger than what's on screen is actually happening. I think, just to mention Mark Snow's score, I think that's really true. I think he does a great job in this. There's some really sort of haunting melodies and, quite percussive stuff in this as well alongside it, and you really get that sense of these grand, alien strange forces sort of pushing down on the action.
There is, and again, like that sequence was one of the ones that I was talking about when I talked about the visual storytelling of R.W. Goodwin. But the soundtrack on there as well is amazing, because you get that cut from, oh my god, they've caught Jeremiah, to all of a sudden you're inside this anonymous prison. And it's Snow's score that really carries you across in a way that's very, very effective. I think Snow is massively underrated in terms of the work that he's done on the show and its spin-offs, and it's moments like that that really sort of demonstrate like just how great he was.
It's true, absolutely. Matt Latham says, it's a bit damp for a finale, if I'm honest. Never really got me interested, and the cliffhanger is nothing in comparison to what the show is capable of. Probably the weakest season finale of the lot that I've seen so far. And my reply to him on The Basement was, you've not seen My Struggle 2 yet, have you? At which point he said, "My struggle one nearly made me want to send the X-Files complete series DVD I ordered back for a refund. So I haven't yet mastered the strength to watch My Struggle 2. So, Latham, it'll be interesting to see what you think, when you get there.
There's also the truth as well. Like, let's not sell My Struggle 2 short. My Struggle 2 is only 45 minutes long. Like, that's one of its virtues.
That's very true, yeah. Cathy Glinski says she thinks it's not the strongest finale, but it's still an interesting episode. I like Jeremiah and Smith and the idea that he represents a healer or saviour. I'm just not sure he was used enough in a compelling enough way. And she gives her top and bottom three. Her bottom three are Teso dos Bichos, shocker, The Walk, and Revelations. Revelations cropping up a bit as well. And her top three are Oze Chunks from Outer Space, Pusher, well done Cathy, and Paperclip. So recurring episodes coming up. Adam Silver, in fact, who we mentioned earlier, his top three are Paperclip, Clyde Bruckman's Final Repose, and a toss-up of Wet Wired / Pusher. So a lot of the same episodes keep coming up, really. James Driver says, I love this episode, love the weird mix of the mundane and the grandiose, love the Brothers K stuff, the interrogation Inquisitor scene in the prison, I love the bounty hunter reveal, and love Mulder finding the alien weapon in the lamp. And of course, the ex-Mulder fight. And his bottom three are Teso dos Bichos, shocker, Hell Money, which, is one I know you're fan of. You were on the episode, obviously. And
obviously
Avatar.
I didn't do a good enough sell.
Well, actually, this may well have been written before that episode came out. So, maybe James has changed his mind.
Yeah.
James, let us know if you've changed your mind or not after listening to it. His top three are Clyde Bruckman, Talitha Cumi, nice, and Nisei. So it's nice to see someone put this in their top three, really. Marlene Stemme, who's always very fascinating when she comments. She says, I think Talitha Cumi has a lot of value in the grand Inquisitor sequences between Jeremiah Smith and the Smoking Man. All of the comments are directly from that chapter of the Brothers K, yet all pertain to themes of taking away freedom in the guise of security and happiness that come up in the future. I think episodes as far forward as a more Fatih and Hollywood AD carry on those ideas, which is what we've said. I also enjoy the theological implications of healing and freedom. Very interesting. I thought the episode seemed more momentous at the time than it does now, but I think Herrenvolk couldn't measure up and has biased my perception. Her bottom three was Avatar, the end of DPO was uninventive, so that's interesting, and conspiracy parts of Wet Wired are bloated. But she says really not truly a bad one in the bunch, and she loves Clyde Bruckman's Final Repose, Paperclip, and Pusher. I think it's some interesting thoughts there. I think about the theological implications of everything in those conversations as well. It just shows how broad a lot of these thoughts are, really.
Yeah, and I mean, I would actually, in terms of the show and in terms of like the argument about it feeling momentous, it is worth noting, I think this is the first time it's explicitly confirmed that like the aliens are plotting colonization. That like the end objective here is like to replace mankind on Earth. Because I mean, when Colony and Endgame were mentioned back in the, in the second season, there's a sense that like those people who were cloning were operating sort of rogue, almost apart from the conspiracy, as opposed to in some way like hoping to supplant humanity. And it's kind of interesting that I think that this is the point at which the mythology really clicks. And you could argue that like everything that you learn after this point is just incremental. So for example, I think that in Patient X and the Red and the Black, you learn, for example, that the date is set, I think, is it 12 years in the future? Or you learn, like, basically that it is set in 2012, that the date is 2012, and obviously in the truth you actually get the date itself is revealed on screen. But it like, this for me still feels momentous, even in hindsight, because it's the point at which Mulder lays out, like, on the table what the central point of the X-Files mythology is, which is this story of colonization, this idea that something is going to come to Earth and do to humans what... And again, this is something the show has touched on obliquely and obviously in the Anasazi, Blessing Way and Paperclip trilogy, that it's going to come to Earth and do to humans what the European settlers did to the indigenous peoples of the United States. It's going to supplant them, replace them, and take the land as their own. And we'll talk a bit more, I suspect, when we get to Herrenvolk, because Herrenvolk, like, takes that image and really, really runs with it. But I think that Talitha Cumi still feels momentous in terms of, like, outlaying what the mythology is, at least for me, even now.
Deana Ferreri says, as a side note, during this Smoking Man Jeremiah Smith conversation, Smoking Man talks about a decline in religious faith and something like science is their god now. Watching in 2018, that line stands out to me because now we see a lot of troubling anti-science sentiment, and Marlene replies with, I think that's interesting about anti-science. I think there's also an extreme of scientific fundamentalism then and now. And I think that's really interesting, that maybe some of these aspects of this conversation have gained more relevance in the, complicated and quite difficult period we're going through now in terms of the rejection of science, and that maybe this episode almost had maybe even a misplaced faith that we were going to supplant, religious dogma and fundamentalism with this belief in science.
It's something that Carter comes back to, and he sort of facilitates. He sort of goes back and forth on, and it's something that I have a great deal of empathy for, because again, I think I don't have all the answers. I think very few people will claim to have all the answers, and I think that Carter acknowledges that he doesn't necessarily have all the answers in terms of how it falls between balancing your faith in something that is more than strictly rational, concrete, and materialistic versus unwavering faith and the challenges that creates in the modern world. Because I pointed out, I think I mentioned earlier in the episode when we were talking about Jeremiah, that there are certain episodes of the X-Files and how they deal with religion that make me deeply uncomfortable, and I'm not sure that they are intended to make me feel uncomfortable in the way that they did. And I'm thinking of say All Souls from season 5, in which Scully gets a message from God that she has to let a bunch of disabled kids die, which is something that makes me really fundamentally uncomfortable in a way that the show kind of romanticizes, and I'm not entirely comfortable with. And again, I'm thinking of Signs and Wonders in the 7th season, where again Frank Spotnitz at the time said that the moral of the story is that sometimes a little intolerance is a good thing. And I'm like, really? Is that, I understand why that might seem like a sentiment you want to play with in the 90s when things were different, but nowadays from a modern perspective it's very, very uncomfortable. And this is the idea, and I think, to be honest, this is something that I think speaks to the power of the X-Files, is that we're still having these conversations now. We're 25 years on, we still haven't come up with answers. We don't watch the show and go, oh my god, this was so stupid. How could they ever have thought that? We watch the show and we go, this is something we are still talking about as a society today. And this is them talking about it then. And while the emphasis and our sort of perception of the questions might have shifted, in that I think that if you ask me now the questions the show is asking, I'd give you a different answer than I would have 10 years ago, and probably different answers than I would have given you 20 years ago. But I think that there is something there, and I think it speaks to the show that it's willing to ask these big questions. I mean, I'm not entirely comfortable with how the show deals with faith and religion in general. I think that, it makes me uneasy. In some ways, the way it makes me uneasy is good. In other ways, I think that it's a reflection of the time in which the show was written, where these questions were a lot more abstract and they carried a lot less immediate political weight than they do at the moment. So they sort of existed in a vacuum and an abstract, and asking them now can be very, very uncomfortable. I mean, see, for example, Babylon. But I do, I admire that the show asked the questions, and I admire that we're still having those conversations now. Yeah,
that's one of the many great things about this show. I'm going to leave the final comment, a couple of comments, to Katie Doe, who says, Talitha Cumi and Herrenvolk are basically Jeremiah Smith saying, I'll explain everything, and then getting interrupted and not explaining anything. And Jeremy Daniels follows that up with, not to mention, they share an entire car ride to Canada in Herrenvolk, and he manages to not to explain anything during the journey.
They just argued over what kind of music they were going to play.
What did they talk about? I mean, that if I tell you anything is the biggest mystery on the X-Files, it's that car journey. And I want the tie-in novel that shows the adventure that Mulder and Jeremiah Smith have on that car journey.
The awkward silence before Jeremiah asks, can we pull over? I need to use the restroom. And Mulder's like, well, you should have gone back when we picked up these juice boxes.
Well, thanks guys for your comments. I apologise I couldn't get all of them in. I might try and sneak in a few more of your top 3, bottom 3s as we do them in a minute now. But some fantastic comments there, and as always, thanks for commenting in the mailbag and telling us what you think of each episode. So we're going to move on and talk a little bit about what we think is the top 3 and bottom 3 episodes of season 3, and just wrap up this season of the X-Files. So what we'll do then, I think we'll go bottom first, then top, bottom, top, so we can finish on our what we think is the best episode of season 3. There's going to be no mystery as to what I'm going to put at number 1, but we'll see when we get there. But so
easy, Tony. Control your passion for the Blessing Way. I know you're very excited about it.
Well, I know. I've got to keep myself together. Okay, right. So let's start with you, Darren. What would you say your third bottom episode of the third season is?
Oh, okay. Oh, so you mean like this is not my worst, we're not starting with my least favourite, we're starting with my third least favourite.
Your third least favourite.
This is a really mean question, because I would argue there are only 2 legitimately, unequivocally bad episodes in the third season. So I feel like I'm lumping this very poor piece of television in there with it. And its main offence, the main problem with the episode I'm about to name, is not that it's bad. It's just that it feels a little bit exploitative and very generic and very straightforward. And it isn't exceptional in the way that other episodes of the third season are, because the third season is a fantastic season of television. So I feel very sorry. Apologies to Don Shaban and Rob Bowman. The Walk would be my third least favourite episode of the season, and it's not a bad episode of television by any measure.
Yeah, I can see that. I think I'm going to say, for my least favourite third one, I think I'm probably going to go for Teso dos Bicos. Now, people might think that that's a bit weird, because surely that's your number one. Surely that's the worst episode of the season. Now, I think that's probably true, actually. I think that's probably true. I think it probably is the worst one in terms of actual ability and quality. But there is something about that episode that is so stupid and so, bad, that there is a perverse enjoyment out of things like Yahweh? You're drinking Yahweh? And things like that. And the cats, and Alfonso Bilac and his sweaty performance all the way through. Things like that. I just find myself... I don't watch it by choice, but if it happens to be on, I will find myself laughing at certain points. So from an entertainment factor, I think I can enjoy that more than a couple of other ones. But, in terms of quality, I think it probably is the worst. Worst one.
I just feel sorry for the fans of the other 2 episodes you're going to mention, Tony.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, guys. So, okay, well, actually, before we go on to our number 2s, our number 3 top ones, let's have a bottom 3 from someone else. So Carl Sweeney, his bottom 3 is... at number 3, The List, which he says isn't bad, but wouldn't be bottom 3 in any other season, because it's a good season. Revelations, which has interesting ideas, but lackluster execution. And then Teso dos Bichos at the beginning, which its reputation suggests it may be so bad it's good, but mostly I just find it soporific. So, yeah, which is probably what a lot of people think. What would you say your third best episode, then, of season 3 is, Darren?
I'm gonna cheat here, because I don't want this to be a list where Darren just names Darren Morgan episodes. So I'm gonna qualify this and say I'm gonna pick episodes by 3 different writers in order to make this a very fair list, because otherwise it would just be, everybody knows what it would be. So I'm also gonna cheat here by counting this 2-parter as a single episode. So Nicene 731 would be my third pick.
Okay. You can get away with that, I think. Why would you put that in there?
It's my favourite mythology episode in the entire run of the show, I would argue. The only possible contender is Patient X and the Red and the Black from the 5th season. It's everything that I kind of would want from a mythology episode. It's got this blockbuster spectacle, it's got this level of paranoia and mistrust, it's got this really tight claustrophobic directions. The first part's directed by David Nutter and the second part's directed by Rob Bowman, which is one of those sort of great director combos. The first part is written by Chris Carter, Howard Gordon and Frank Spotnitz, and the second part's written by Frank Spotnitz. Which is this dream team of sort of writers where you have Carter's big ideas, Gordon's sense of propulsive momentum. Gordon's the guy who would go on to write Homeland and 24 and also co-wrote F. Emasculata, so he can get a thing going. And also just Frank Spotnitz's sort of ability to bring clarity to the mythology. I think that Spotnitz is one of the great writers for making the mythology easy to understand and relatively straightforward and very sort of accessible. And it goes and it has these big ideas about guilt, memory, shame, the Second World War. It also has one of my favorite sequences, which comes from 731, which is the moment where Scully and Mulder are having a phone conversation where they're both inside the same train car in their own weird way, except they're both seeing very different things. Scully is inside a copy of the train car with the First Elder, and Mulder is inside a train car with an assassin from the NSA, and possibly an alien in the trunk. And it's this really great metaphor for what the X-Files is, where Mulder and Scully can be standing in very literally the same space as one another, but seeing and perceiving entirely different things and understanding an entirely different sort of chain of events. And it's one of the most beautiful sequences in the show, and it's highlighted on this roller coaster propulsive, rocket propelled mythology episode, which has everything that I would want from a mythology two-parter.
I don't think you'd be on your own. I think quite a few people would put it in there as well. I'm going to stick with mythology for my number 3, which is Paperclip, which I think is a terrific episode. I think it's one of the best mythology episodes that was ever done. We talked about Paperclip obviously in depth with Chris Knowles, and geeked out over it at the beginning of this season. But I haven't. There aren't enough superlatives in the world for Paperclip. It's one of the best episodes of the show. So yeah, it's a great episode. Let's go for a top 3 then. So we've got Andrew Blaker's top 3, which is Wet Wired at number 1, which is not one everyone puts in the top 3. His number 2 is Pusher, and his number 3 is Jose Chung's From Outer Space. So that's a neat mix. Number 2's then, Darren. What would you say your second least favourite episode of season 3 is?
Surprising absolutely nobody, it's The Blessing Way.
Shocker. From Paperclip to The Blessing Way.
It's a nice segue there.
Yeah, for more detail on why Darren doesn't love The Blessing Way, check out the fact I put him through the ordeal of the talking about it for an hour and a half at the beginning of the season.
To be fair, let's be fair here and say, even when I don't like The Blessing Way, I have very serious problems with The Blessing Way. I admire The Blessing Way, which is something this is a season of television where I'm saying my second least favorite episode of television in this season is an episode that I admire. I admire that Carter did something like this as a season premiere. This is a good season of television, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah,
there's no doubt about that. No doubt about that. The majority of people who do the 5 Questions of X name this as the best season. So, I can't disagree. My number 2, my second least favourite, is probably going to be Revelations, just to stick with the the pattern that we've seen with a few other people, because I find it to be... I find it interesting how it flips Mulder around to be the skeptic. It's really sort of sets in stone this idea that when it comes to organised religion, he just can't get there. He doesn't believe in that. He just can't do it. And it flips it around that Scully's the one putting the focus. But I like the last line. I like the, I'm afraid God is speaking, but no one's listening. I think that's a lovely final moment. But I find it really overwrought. It's to me, it felt like a bad episode of Millennium. Like a really bad episode of Millennium. I just didn't click with me. I just find it to be quite laborious, quite dull. And it, wastes R. Lee Ermey. You're going to get someone like that in. Give him a proper part. Don't let him just die off in the first 5 minutes. The drill sergeant from Full Metal Jacket, for God's sake. What are you doing?
And it also has Michael Berryman as well in it.
Yeah. Michael Berryman as well. He's good with his terrifying face, but he's very good. So yeah, I think that could have been so much better than it was ultimately. But there you go. Let's do another bottom 3 then. Robert Buckles, his bottom 3. Well, he says the only one that really has no merit to it at all is Teso dos Bichos. Everything else in the season is really good. So he's another one of the people banging that drum, which is completely understandable, really. Okay, so second best episode of the season then, Darren. What are you going to go for?
I'm going to go with Pusher.
Yay! Woo!
I was worried. I didn't know what reaction I was going to get from you, whether it was going to be a woo, congratulations, it's there, or what do you mean too? But yeah, Pusher.
Look, I fully understand, Darren, that not everyone loves Pusher, but what I will do as a number 1, but what I will do is from season 4 onwards, I'm going to contractually oblige everyone who appears on the Xcast to say it's number 1. So this is you got away with it this time, but
I like that. You don't have to actually believe that it's number one. You just have to say that it is. Validate it. 'Cause it is. It's propulsive. It's amazing. It's another Rob Bowman episode. It's a Rob Bowman and Vince Gilligan episode, which is like a combination, like a wonderful combination of writer and director. It's propulsive. It's exciting. It's compelling. It's one of those great, like, if you want to introduce somebody to the X-Files, this is one of the most perfect episodes to do it with, because it's not only... Is it? And I mean, my number one is also obviously going to be a good choice, but it's less indicative of what the show is week to week. Whereas on the other hand, Pusher, and by the way, I've just given away what my number one was there, but Pusher is very much like, Pusher is what the show does almost every week, except every single part of it is working at the very least, as good as it ever will. And that's astounding.
Definitely. Can't disagree. Completely with you. And, if you haven't already, listened to our, over nearly 2-hour exploration about Pusher, which is one of my favourite episodes I've ever done with the Xcast, where we go into more detail about that. Fascinating conversation, if I say so myself. So Carl Sweeney, going back to him for his top 3, he says his number 3 is Oublié, which is Duchovny knocks it out the park in an all too unheralded episode. And there's some great conversation he has with Chris Knowles, in particular, about the symbology of Oublié, which is really worth listening to earlier in the season. Paperclip at number 2, a totemic mythology episode. Nice description, Carl. And his number 1 is Clyde Bruckman's Final Repose, Darren Morgan's finest hour. So my number 2, off the back of that, conveniently, is Clyde Bruckman's Final Repose, actually. Yeah, because I do agree with Carl. I think it is Darren Morgan's finest hour. I think, yes, Ose Chung is hilarious, and I understand why that is, for a lot of people, their favourite episode of season 3, and for a lot of people, their favourite Darren Morgan episode. I completely get it, and I think it's in my top 5, don't get me wrong. But I think Clyde Bruckman's Final Repose is the best thing that Darren Morgan has ever done in any of the mediums, to be honest. I just think it's really beautiful and haunting and sad and funny and blackly comic and bleak. Peter Boyle is marvellous. It's just some wonderfully mordant yet affecting writing, and I can't say enough about it. Really, it's a wonderful piece of TV.
It is, and it won an Emmy for outstanding writing as well, deservedly, and for its guest star. So it's a tremendous piece of television. And being honest, it would probably be my third if I hadn't implemented what I call the Darren Morgan rule.
Yeah, but
which next year will be called the Morgan and Wong rule.
The Morgan and Wong. I like that. Yeah, that's a flash forward to Gethsemane there, guys. Yeah, let's go back to Robert Buckles, who his top 3 are Pusher. Number 1, Paper. Yes, well done, Robert. Paperclip and Ose Chung. I'm just saying, well done, everyone who's put Pusher in. You are
You're
a friend
correct.
of mine.
Objectively correct. You got the right answer.
Exactly.
Tony said a question. You guys moved to the top of the class.
Answered it correctly. Well done. And Ose Chung is his number 3. Okay, so Darren, what is the worst episode, in your opinion, of season 3?
I mean, come on. I've had 2 shots and I haven't taken them at this particular episode. There's no way that it wasn't going to be Clyde Bruckman's Final Repo. No. It is Tezo Dos Bichos. Tezo Dos Bichos is not a good episode of television. And Tony, you should feel bad for the things that you said earlier this discussion. No, it's not good. It's boring is the thing. It's not only bad, I don't find it particularly interesting in the way that it's bad. It's just dull. It's lifeless. And I mean, you can tell that, and again, Kim Manners is trying to do it, and you can tell, reading the behind-the-scenes production history of the episode would almost make a better episode of The X-Files than it does, because, obviously the people are trying, except you're dealing with all these hurdles along the way. The fact that you can't get cats to act is one of them. The fact that Gillian Anderson, one of your 2 leads on the show, is allergic to cats in an episode about cats is also a big issue with the episode. And just the fact that it's dull, it's lifeless, it's generic, it's being honest, this probably wouldn't be, it might not even make my bottom 3 of the first or second seasons, if we're being entirely honest, but of the 3rd season, it's the obvious clunker of the bunch.
Yeah, I mean, I can't disagree with any of that. You know what I mean? I think if there was one paltry defence of it, I would say that it's not as objectionably awful as Excelsis Day, like from last season. Do you know what I mean? I mean, that one's borderline offensive. Well, it's not borderline, it is offensive.
I
Whereas
mean,
this
like,
one...
a ghost rapist empowered by an immigrant from, was it the Asian orderly is how he's described in the episode? I feel like
named Gung.
Yeah, but
right.
you don't find that out until much later. You also don't find out his like country of origin until the closing monologue as well, because you can tell that somebody watching the episode is like, oh crap, we should probably fix that. Tessa Dos Bichos passes the In Excelsis Day test.
Yeah, exactly. And most episodes would, and so it's not really a very good defense of it. Apart from that, I can't disagree with what you've said at all. My least favourite, I have to say, again, this is where, probably in realistic terms, you would flip these two around in terms of where I place Tessa Dos Bichos and where I place this one in terms of quality. But my least favourite, if I'm honest, is The Walk. And, you mentioned The Walk earlier, it was in your bottom three. I think The Walk might be the most boring episode of The X-Files I've ever watched in my life. It's certainly in the top three or maybe top five of the most boring X-Files. And it's very rare I find the X-Files boring. Very, very rare. Even episodes that aren't necessarily as good. But this, the guy who plays Rappo is the most annoying character in the world. It's got a lifeless plot. Mulder and Scully look bored. It's got some, ridiculous sort of contrivances in it. I find the whole thing really laborious, and hats off to Clara Cook and Sarah Blair, who managed to talk about it for an hour, because I'm already bored and I've been talking about it for 2 minutes. So, good, fair play to them. I can't be doing with it. I skip it every time. I will skip it without a question.
I don't think I'd actually skip even Tessa Dos Bichos if I were doing a third season rewatch, which is pretty good. Like, I mean, again, I love how we're talking about the worst episodes. We're like, season 3 is actually not that bad.
Well, exactly. And I think that, that's something that's coming out with a lot of these different responses. Thinking of bottom threes, Andrew Blaker gives his number 1 as Tessa Dos Bichos. His number 2 is The Walk. And, sorry, Darren, his number 3 is Hell Money. Again.
It just means I've got more work to do, Tony.
Exactly. Okay, then. So, what's your number 1? What's the best episode in your mind of season 3?
Well, I mean, it's quite clear. It's Jose Chung's From Outer Space, simply based on, like, working around what I was talking about there. But yeah, Jose Chung's From Outer Space is one of the best episodes of television that's ever been made. And I think you could argue Pusher is as well, which says something about the quality of the third season as a whole. And it's one of my favourite episodes of The X-Files. It's not as good as, it wouldn't be... Which is ironic, because as much as I love the third season, Jose Chung From Outer Space would probably rank lower to me than, say, for example, Never Again from the fourth season, or One Breath from the second season. But it's still a phenomenal piece of television that it's this wonderful meditation on the idea of, how, even if we're not alone in the universe, all of us are in our own way alone in the world, and how we sort of make peace with that, and how we try to figure out how not to be, and how to understand other people, however difficult that might be. It's this beautiful sort of melancholy sort of tone poem about how strange and arbitrary the world around us can be, and how hard it can be to try and force what little information we have about it into something that is a coherent narrative. And it's just, it's beautiful, it's compassionate, it's sweet, it's got an amazing performance, a guest performance from Charles Nelson Riley, and it's playful, but without ever seeming cynical or cruel. And I love that about it a great deal. I absolutely adore it. I
can't disagree. I think it's fabulous, and it's me not making my top 3 doesn't mean I don't love it. Like I say, it'll probably be in my top 5. It would probably realistically be my number 4. Actually, my number 4 choice. It's great. It's hilarious. It's wonderful. It's got so many great moments to it. Although I have to say, and this might be a bit controversial, but I think I like Jose Chung's Doomsday Defense on Millennium more. Which
I like it as much, I think.
Yeah, at least as much, but maybe I like that more, but I don't know. It's been a long time since I've watched Doomsday Defense, which we will be doing on the Time Is Now podcast in the next year or so, keep an eye out for that. But yeah, okay, my number 1, well, I'm just gonna sum it up in a series of very familiar words, really. Pusher. Pusher.
Sorry, Tony. The line was pretty bad there. It sounds like you said Swaisigi. Did I hear yes. Swaisigi?
Swaisigi, yeah. Okay, so that's it. That's it for me. Yeah. That's funny. So yeah, Pusher. You all know why. I'm not going to sit. Darren summed it up perfectly well. We've done a whole hour and a half episode on it. I bang on about it every week I'm on. Pusher. End of the day, it's the best episode of the X-Files ever made. Thanks everyone for your top threes, bottom three. Sorry if I missed anybody out. Do feel free to shout at us for that and keep telling us them. But let's wrap up Talitha Cumi and wrap up season 3 coverage by doing a little bit of a roundup. I mean, let's do a score rating. I mean, let's do it in that way. And Darren, you've written a book on the X-Files. You've talked a lot about season 3. You've been on quite a few of these episodes. So if you're gonna we do an episode grading. Let's do a season grading. So out of 10, what would you give season 3 of the X-Files as a whole, Darren?
10. It's an easy 10. And it's kind of strange because I'm trying to think, have I been on... I think Pusher was the 110. Oh no, did I give Paperclip a 10 as well? I think I gave Paperclip a 9. Pusher may be the 110 that I've given the season, which makes it sound really strange that I give the season as a whole a 10. But it is astounding. It's one of my favourite 20-odd episode seasons of television. It's a season of television that works remarkably well. We suggested this when we were talking about the cliffhanger. What the third season does so well, at least for me as an audience member, is that it takes a look at the second season, which was a period of experimentation. And I know a lot of people love the second season, and I like the second season a lot, but the thing that holds back the second season for me is that it's very uneven, and particularly towards the end, there's a sense that everybody on the staff has been working so hard and pushing the show so far that they just sort of collapse into themselves, and you get a host of episodes like .com, for example, or Feel for Symmetry, where it doesn't feel like everything's working. But with the third season, they have the luxury of going back and looking at the second season and figuring out what worked about it, having a bit of space, and then building an entire season around it. And it's astounding. It's basically taking everything that worked, throwing out everything that didn't, and producing this ruthless, relentless machine of television where everything is much more assured, much more confident, much more ambitious. And I mean, even if you were to take an average middle-of-the-road episode from this season, so take, for example, the introduction to DPO, and I don't think, I'm not sure that anybody mentioned DPO. I think Marlene mentioned certain sequences from DPO, but I don't think anybody that I've heard mentioned DPO as one of their favorite episodes. But the opening sequence of DPO is just an astounding piece of television. The bit where they have James's Ring the Bell playing as the guy is being shocked alive after playing the arcade game. And just that level of professionalism applied to absolutely everything across the season. So that you can point to episodes like Oubliette, for example, as an unheralded classic because it's so good, but it somehow gets lost in the shuffle between all these other really fantastic episodes of television. It's just mind-boggling. There are entire 5-season-long, 7-season-long TV shows that would struggle to produce as many good episodes as the X-Files did in this stretch of the third season. And it's remarkably consistent, and it's remarkably confident, and there's a thematic through line, and this is one of the things about the third season, is that, I don't think Carter ever sat down with a whiteboard with his staff and said, look, this is what we're talking about this year, and, wrote, I don't know, Holocaust or World War II. But it does feel like when you're watching the third season, the writing staff had conversations about what they were all thinking about, and they'd sort of allowed those ideas to sort of permeate. And so you get this idea, this sort of and we talk a little bit in the third season about how there's a Chinese wall that exists between the mythology and the standalones. How, the mythology has become its own thing, sort of walled off from the regular Monster of the Week episodes. But even thematically, there's a huge overlap between, I'm thinking, for example, the conversation between, the hard-faced man and Scully in the massively underrated Hell Money, which obviously has parallels to the conversation between the cigarette-smoking man and Jeremiah Smith and Talitha Cumi about, freedom, choice, and how you govern people and how you control people by offering them hope. But even things like, say, for example, the idea of the transference of evil, to pick an example, Grotesque, which is right before the two-parter that introduces the black oil, which is its own infectious sort of spreading sort of evil. And you have that throughout. You have After Mulder's confronted the idea of, like, the loss of Samantha based on a decision that his father made, you have Oubliette, which is a standalone story about a little girl who's victimized by this horrific man. This sort of, the way that we inflict suffering on women in society, and the way that we marginalize them and we sort of hurt them, and the way in which we have sort of systemic structures that do that. And you have this wonderful thing that runs through the season of almost as above, so below, where all these ideas are playing in concert with one another, to the point where they all fit together, and you have this whole motif about, like, memory and legacy and consequences and guilt and responsibility that play through not just the mythology episodes or what people think of the mythology episodes, but even to the standalones, where they feel of a piece with one another in a way that I don't think the show ever quite manages again. There's a sense that the entire orchestra is playing the same tune, even when they're in theory playing different sections. It's absolutely breathtaking, and watching it from beginning to end is a fantastic experience, even if it's not serialized in the way that, say, season 8 is, or modern television would be.
Well, I think that's a great summation, really. I think it would be easy to put season 3. Somebody said to you, what's the ideal season of the X-Files, where it's at its peak, or it's close to its peak, or it's achieving some of the best work it's ever done. I think you'd be hard pressed to name something other than season 3. Really, I think it's not my favourite season, but I can understand the argument that it's possibly the best and possibly the most cohesive ultimately, and has the most, like you say, that upswing of professionalism and just some outstanding episodes, and it will always be, because of Pusher, it will always be important to me as well as a season, and for many other episodes as well.
So does that Pusher the whole season up?
We had to end on a pun, didn't we? Had to be done. And
it's Cerulean blew the competition away. It's a Model season, as it were.
Oh, you are on fire here. Absolutely. Cecil Lively is in the building.
Much like Steve Batchik, I am on fire.
But yeah, it's been a great season to talk about, and hopefully you guys have enjoyed our breakdowns of season 3. And thanks to all the X-Files fans and podcasters who've been on our season 3 coverage of the show, which has been fantastic, really, over the last. Over the majority and a big chunk of 2018 that we've been airing these episodes. But
Tony, there's somebody you forgot, actually, which is, I think I speak on behalf of everybody who's been on the podcast, everybody who's listened to the podcast. Thank you very much for organising this, because there was no way I was going to end the episode without acknowledging that.
Oh, that's very kind of you, Darren. Thank you.
It's a phenomenal endeavour, like the amount of organisation and effort that it takes. It's I am in awe. I am in awe of it, and I suspect a lot of people are as well. So thank you very much.
Well, it's very nice of you to say. It's and it's me being a terrible deflector here of praise, but it would not exist without all of you guys. Without you, Darren, without everybody else who contributes, without everyone who listens, and whether it's just any listener of the show or our patrons or anything like that. You guys are the reason that I want to keep doing it ultimately, because the whole thing about podcasting is, and this is something that sometimes people can forget or it gets lost, is that the joy of recording, the joy of podcasting isn't just about talking about what you love. It's about meeting people to talk about that with. And that's the beauty of it. And that's why I think we've got a great XCast community, and it's only grown over the last few years. And as we edge into 2019, hopefully it will grow even more. So yeah, it's been great fun, and it will continue to be great fun. We've got years left. I think I've calculated the show, and I've probably said this on the show before, I think I've calculated that we're scheduled to maybe end the show in about 2023. But that all depends on whether we get a season 12 or a reboot or another movie.
Tony, what you're saying is the date is set.
Yes, the date is set. For now, the date will probably change, is what it should be, really.
You should wait until like the 5th season recaps, where you're like, we've calculated that it will end in about another 3 years, and then you wait until like the 9th season recaps. You're like, oh, by the way, we've decided it's the 27th of May, 2023. You got to drip feed this information out, Tony.
Yeah, and then in true X-Files fashion, I will miss that date, and then we'll wait another 10 years, and then it'll come back.
And we'll get everybody back together, yeah.
And we'll get the band back together in 2033, by which point I will be 51 years old. Good Lord above.
And it'll turn out that I never liked the X-Files at all or something crazy like that. But that's okay because it was all just a dream, possibly.
Yeah. So it's all. We're all in the mind of a little boy in a hospital, like in St. Elsewhere. That's the whole big Uber theory, and we're sticking to it. But no, it's been great. It's been great fun to talk about this episode. It's been great fun to talk about season 3. And as always, Darren, thank you so much for joining me for this.
Thank you for having me.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Until you return, you're going to be back talking Herrenvolk. You're going to kick off season 4 with me in a couple of months. Or maybe even like right now, if you're listening in binge listening to the entire episode, you might not have to wait that long. But until then, what are you up to? Where can people find you, and what's happening?
Well, apparently I'm taking a long car journey with you, in which we'll discuss things that nobody will ever know about. But yeah, you can find me online at Darren_Mooney on Twitter. I do a whole host of other sort of things. I published a couple of books. I published the X-Files book, which is Opening the X-Files, which is available from McFarlane's. I'm very, very proud of that book. I've also published another book, which is Christopher Nolan, A Critical Study of the Films, which is actually just out now as we're recording. Should still be relatively hot off the presses as we're releasing this as well, which is a project that I've been working on for the past year or so. I'm very proud. I'm very happy with how it came out. It's a project that's very kind of close to my heart. I've always wanted to do it, and I'm very happy with how it turned out. So if you are at all interested in, say, Christopher Nolan as a director, or even 21st century cinema as it exists in blockbuster form, give that a read. And I understand it's coming up to Christmas, and being honest, this is an academic book. It can be quite expensive. So even if you just ask your local library to get into stock, that would mean a lot to me as well. Or leave a positive review on Amazon as well. Help get the word out about it as well. That would also be very helpful. I co-host a podcast called The 250, which takes a weekly look at the top 250 movies of all time as voted for by IMDb users, which is great fun. Tony has been a guest on a couple of occasions. He was last on discussing Infinity War. We're still not sure if Thanos disintegrated him with the click of his fingers. And then finally, I do a weekly podcast called the Scan-On Podcast, which is an Irish look at the world of film and television, where we talk about what we watched this week, the top 10, and the new releases. So if you want a weekly dose of Darren talking about film, that's a good forum for it, I think, as well.
Why would you not want that, is the question, guys. And don't write your answers on a postcard. Just listen to all that stuff, and definitely check out Darren's books. Most of you have probably read Opening the X-Files, but if you haven't, get on that especially, because it is marvellous.
And just to say thank you very much for everybody for all the support. It really is genuinely touching. I'm constantly in awe of the fact that I got to do it, and that people actually seem to have enjoyed it. So thank you very much, guys.
Well, it's you wouldn't it wouldn't be said if it wasn't a great book. You know what I mean? So it really is worth it. So thank you for writing it. It's been great. So yeah, we're going to be back soon. For those of you who are listening, one after the other, very soon. But if you're listening live, as it were, we're going to have a little break. We're going to have the X quiz, the annual X quiz, which I might as well reveal at this stage is going to be revival focused. So it's going to be about seasons 10 and 11 only this year, which I think is quite appropriate, really, as opposed to the whole show. So that'll be quite fun, bit of a different spin on it. But that'll be out at Christmas. And then we'll be back for season 4 early February, and we'll be part of something bigger, which has already been announced. But the Xcast is going to become part of a podcast network, which we're setting up called We Made This, which is going to launch in January. It will include The Time Is Now, the Millennium new podcast spin-off, which Darren and I have already recorded one episode of, and there's going to be a few more. And we've got a whole team of people working on that. And one or two other things as well, which have been announced already. Podcasts about Castle, podcasts about Fringe, and there's even more things in the pipeline. So there's going to be some exciting stuff in 2019. And the Xcast will be leading the charge of the flagship show of that. So that's going to be really fun. So keep an eye out for that going into next year. And if you're a patron of the show, which you can become at patreon.com/the Xcast, you get early access to a lot of this stuff, including interviews with Brendan Beiser, a.k.a. Agent Pendrell, poor Agent Pendrell, Chris Owens, a.k.a. The Young Smoking Man, and Jeffrey Spender. Lovely man. Lovely man. Really nice guy. They're all lovely, actually. They're all really nice. And Stephen Williams, of course, Mr. X, who is a dude. Such a funny guy. So, yeah, and there'll be more to come. Hopefully, by the time you hear this, we will have had William B. Davis back on the show as well. So,
nice.
Again, patrons will get it earlier than everybody else. So, sign yourselves up, guys, and you can be there. But, yeah, if not, until next year, we've done season 3. It's another season in the bag. It's really exciting. But yeah, thanks again, guys. It means the world that you listen, especially to all of us who put all this work in. So remember, until we see each other again, as always, trust no one. Especially Jeremiah Smith, because he's probably not going to tell you the truth.
Tony, I can explain everything to you.
The X-Cast, an X-Files podcast, is produced and presented by Tony Black, alongside a dedicated group of podcasters and X-Files fans. You can find us on Twitter at The X-Cast, and on Facebook if you type in The X-Cast, or at our group, X-Files Basement, an X-Cast podcast fan group, where you can continue the discussion about all things Mulder and Scully. If you want to support The X-Cast further, you can now subscribe and become a patron of the show on Patreon. On Google, just type patreon.com/The Xcast. That's Patreon. You'll see all of our tiers, subscription options and perks, which include early access to episodes, bonus content such as commentaries on X-Files episodes, access to a patron chat zone, and even appearing on one of our patron roundtable discussions. We would appreciate any support you can give the show, so just go to patreon.com/The Xcast to find out more. Our title music is provided courtesy of Will A, who you can find on Twitter at IamWillAYE.